Welcome back, brothers and heretics, to Grimhammer. Tonight we're going to lore behind the Still Brethren, a Chaos Warband, and the Iron Warriors. Before that, be sure to like and comment any videos or topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor or the Dark Gods. And I want to thank you guys for your support. I've been killing it like usual. Now, let's get into the video.
The Vox recording began with a hiss like flensing knives drawn across rusted iron. For a moment there was only static and the weary thump of a mortal heart somewhere near the pickup rune. Then a voice, male and ragged, spoke in high Gothic scoured roar by overuse. By authority of the Holy Ordos, this is Inquisitorial Archive designation Sigma Iron, Interrogator Malchior of the Ordo Hereticus, attached to the Bastion World Triad of the Garrus line. Subject, the warband known as the Steel Brethren. They are an offshoot cancer of the 4th Legion, once numbered among the Iron Warriors, now wholly given over to the service of Chaos Undivided. They are siege specialists without peer among the traitor legions, exemplars of cold attrition and mathematically precise slaughter. Their record is fragmentary, their casualties inflicted upon the Imperium are not. Recommend classification, extreme threat to all fortress worlds. Recommend standing order, upon any credible report of their presence. Raise all defense protocols to maximum, request immediate reinforcement, and prepare for the certainty that your walls will not hold. Iron within, iron without. That was the creed of their Primarch. In them, that creed has rotted into something altogether worse. The recording crackled and died. It was one fragment among many, sealed in data vaults and forbidden libraria, easily overlooked by those who had never stood upon a battlement and heard siege guns speak until their bones vibrated in sympathy. But for those who had seen fortress worlds fall, the name of the Steel Brethren carried a weight like grav shackles around the heart. They were sons of Medrengard. On that demon world there was no true sun, no day and night as lesser planets understood the cycle. The sky was an endless bruise, lit by furnace glow and the sullen flicker of artillery shells bursting in the upper atmosphere. The land was a scabrous plate of fortress manufactoria and gun, emplacements, razorback ridges of ferrocrete and adamantine rising in endless lines. Slave pits yawned between them like infected wounds, crowded with the wretched masses who fed the foundries with ore, sweat and flesh. Here, the Iron Warriors had built their home. Here, Perturabo's sons were broken and reforged. The fortress factories hammered without pause, beating armor plate and bunker casements into shape with cyclopean presses. Macro cannon barrels, each large enough to swallow a habstack whole, rolled upon chains to where demon engines and mortal slaves alike hauled them up into the waiting mouths of citadel walls. Titans strode across the horizon like walking towers, their carapace batteries thundering as they tested new configurations of firepower upon captive continents. The air stank of propellant fumes, hot oil, and the copper tang of too much shed blood. In the warrens beneath those citadels, in the maze of galleries and barracks carved into the bedrock, iron, warriors trained. They were not nurtured. They were not taught mercy, nor even glory. They were instructed in equations of fire and stone, in ranges and angles and stress tolerances. They were shown how long a column could advance under overlapping fields of fire before it ceased to exist. They were made to watch as slave cohorts were driven out into kill zones, so that they would learn what effective artillery did to unarmored flesh. Those companies which did not meet expectation were culled. Sometimes the culling was literal, bolter fire in a confined drill hall, or a slow suffocation as bulkheads sealed and atmosphere was vented. Sometimes it was more subtle, entire cohorts simply assigned to impossible assaults that would erase their weakness beneath enemy walls. On Medrengard, failure and death were the same words spoken in different tones. The Iron Warriors were organized into grand companies, each a kingdom of iron and spite unto itself. They warred against the Imperium, against Xenos empires, and often enough against each other. Siege masters schemed against their rivals, seeking better positions, access to superior forges, rights to particular demon engines or slave stocks. Fortresses on Medrengard did not merely test new designs upon external enemies. They turned their guns inward as well, settling internal disputes with macro shells and bombardments that shook the world's crust. Only relentless attrition proved worth. A grand company that could not endure sustained siege on a dozen fronts was unworthy of Perturabo's name. A warsmith who could not hold his fortress against both loyalist attack and treachery from his own kin deserved only execution and recycling. It was in this crucible that the warriors who would become the Steel Brethren were forged. During the long war that had dragged on since the betrayal of Terra, there were iron warriors who grew dissatisfied even with their legion's pitiless methods. The classic pattern of planetfall, encirclement, trenchwork, and slow-grinding bombardment had served the 4th Legion well since the days of the Great Crusade. But there were officers who had watched too many campaigns degenerate into stagnant slaughter, too many sieges where the cost in shells and warriors outstripped the worth of the prize. They were not sentimental. They did not balk at collateral ruin or at the leveling of entire continents. What offended them was waste. They had names once, those siege captains and line officers. In the memories of their mortal serfs, in the hushed curses of surviving imperial veterans, those names had been erased. What remained were ciphers and titles, designations given by enemies who had survived long enough to report. The Iron Confessor, the Chain-Forged, the Unyielding. These were the epithets of a single warsmith, or perhaps of several, depending on which archive you consulted. In some accounts, he was a gaunt figure in hazard-striped plate, his armor engraved with litany sigils rather than the snarling demon faces favored by many of his kin. In others, he was described as a hulking brute, encased in thickened ceramite, festooned with chains and locks, a walking siege gate that nothing could move once he had set his stance. In all such records, the details were muddled, contradictory, smudged by fear and time. The truth was perhaps simpler. Identities shifted over 10,000 years. Plates of warplate changed hands. Titles were inherited, stolen, or bestowed by screaming enemies as their bastions fell. The warsmith who would lead the Steel Brethren was less a single man than an idea given iron flesh, the incarnation of ruthless, calculated siegecraft taken to its ultimate conclusion. His followers were cut from similar steel. They were line officers, the hard spine of the Iron Warriors, men who had spent entire campaigns knee-deep in mud and rubble, directing bombardments from forward observation posts while enemy fire chewed the horizon. They had stood on the glacis of imperial citadels in the days before the heresy, calculating exactly how much explosive force would be required to bring down each bastion. Later, after their oaths had blackened, they applied the same discipline to worlds they once would have been sworn to defend. Across the long war, they fought in a score of unnamed sieges, from the corpse-choked trenches of nameless fortress moons to the ring worlds of long-dead Xenos that were shattered for no reason, save the 4th Legion's desire to test their guns upon exotic alloys. They learned, they catalogued, they kept ledgers of bombardment patterns that worked, and of those that did not. Gradually, a preference emerged. Where other Iron Warriors were content to ring a fortress in earthworks and slow artillery, these officers began to favor drop assaults and gunship spearheads that knifed into key defensive nodes and command structures. Landing into the teeth of enemy fire, they would secure central bastions, vox relays and power spines, cutting the heart from a defense grid while outer walls still roared defiantly. Once those nodes were taken, the rest of the fortress could be strangled at leisure, its turrets turned inward, its supply lines severed. It was not mercy. The suffering inflicted by such surgical strikes was often worse. The defenders, deprived of command and coordination, would fight on in isolated pockets, starving and cut off, bombarded by their own guns now slave to traitor control. Every shell was counted. Every breach was measured. Every life extinguished was another line upon a ledger of iron. Their war cry remained that of their Primarch, but in their mouths it became something different. Iron within, iron without. On Medrengard, it was a line from an oath, a phrase barked in the training halls and carved upon the stone of the fortress walls. To these siege masters, it became a curse they threw at the skies as they descended in drop pods, wreathed in fire. It was a promise that the iron in their veins, the cold logic of their hearts, matched the iron of their guns and their fortresses. No compassion within, no weakness without. In the slave pits, mortal men whispered of them. The Iron Warriors were all monsters, all torturers and butchers, but even among them there were hierarchies of horror. These particular officers were said to stand upon the parapets and watch as slaves died in their thousands beneath test bombardments, not out of sadism, but out of dead curiosity. How many impacts until the trench line ceased to be? How long until the screaming stopped? How much ammunition did that require? Could the equation be refined? Within the cavernous strategium halls of Medrengard, grand companies argued and clashed. Schematics of fortress worlds flickered in the air, projected in ghostlight above vast adamantine tables. Warsmiths shouted, slammed fists of augmetic iron upon the surface, invoked Perturabo's dictates, like scripture, as they proposed sieges that would last centuries. Sieges that would grind planets to dust in slow, grinding inevitability. The future Steel Brethren stood apart, their helms silent, their eyes calculating. Why spend centuries when decades would suffice? Why accept attrition when annihilation could be made swift, precise, efficient? That was the heart of the schism that began to grow within the 4th Legion. On Medrengard, everything was a test. Everything was a trial of iron and will. The opinions of a cadre of siege officers might have remained a footnote in that endless calculus, had the galaxy outside not continued to burn. The long war offered opportunity. Chaos called for conquests. The Imperium raised new fortress worlds with every century, each a thorn in the eye of the traitor legions. For the Iron Warriors, this should have been a feast. Yet too often, those feasts turned to ash, as campaigns bogged down, as fresh Imperial reinforcements arrived faster than the supplies of the besiegers, as rival warbands interfered, or the warp itself turned traitor. The officers who would one day march as the Steel Brethren, and the warsmith who would be known by a dozen names, began to whisper among themselves. Their conclaves were held in shadowed galleries overlooking the forges, the air thick with the scream of tortured metal. They spoke of new methods, of drop assault spears that would pierce fortresses to the marrow, of gunship task forces that would circle like hunting raptors, striking only when the prey's neck was exposed. They codified their thoughts. They drew up new equations. They began to test their methods in the field. On some distant fortress moon, whose name no one remembered, an Imperial bastion that should have taken 10 years to break fell in less than one. On a ringwall world in the segmented reaches, the garrison found its own macro cannon turned inward within weeks of the traitor's arrival. Some warsmiths took note and nodded grudging approval. Others saw only doctrinal heresy. The 4th Legion had always prized endurance, stubbornness, the slow crush of inevitability. To speak openly of faster wars, of cleaner equations of destruction, was to imply that Perturabo's original designs could be improved. That thought was unforgivable in the minds of many. Lines hardened. Words once muttered in quiet alcoves became accusations hurled across strategium tables. Shells meant for loyalist worlds found new trajectories. Test fired upon the bastions of fellow Iron Warriors in acts of sudden, vicious fratricide. The guns of Medrengard, long turned outward, began to swing upon their own. Later generations of Imperial savants would call it the dispute of iron. On Medrengard, it had no formal name. It was simply another war, another test of survival in a world built to crush the unworthy. The guns of fortress spires roared against their neighbors. Gunships clawed the air in duels above the rust plains, contrails staining the bruise-colored sky. Slave pits were emptied as meat for the trenches, their former masters now aiming guns at each other instead of at the Imperium beyond. In the opening salvos of that internal war, the siege masters who would become the Steel Brethren took their first decisive steps. Their drop assault craft launched not against Imperial walls, but against rival citadels. Their gunships knifed through friendly flak, engines howling, to strike at the command bastions of those who had denounced their doctrines. They were not yet a separate warband, not yet named in inquisitorial archives as a distinct blight upon the galaxy. They were still, in that moment, merely a cluster of Grand Company elements fighting for their vision of what the Fourth Legion should be. They did not yet know whether the dispute of iron would grind them down into the rubble of Medrengard, another failed experiment discarded in the furnaces, or whether it would carve them out from the flesh of the Legion as something new and far worse. Iron within, iron without. The words echoed in the blast chambers and siege tunnels of the demon world as the guns began to speak. The data slate was an old thing, its adamantine casing scored by claws and pitted by shrapnel. Its runes flickered with the sullen glow of an almost spent power cell. When the Iron Warrior who had scavenged it from the ruins of a fallen fortress finally cracked its wards and called its spirits to heal, a single file opened, stamped with a faded catechism seal. Question: what was the dispute of iron? Answer: it was the day Medrengard remembered that iron may grind against itself as easily as against the enemy. Question: where did the dispute of iron take place? Answer: upon the demon world of Perturabo, and upon all fortress realms that bent the knee to the Fourth Legion. Citadel fired upon citadel. Battery turned upon battery. Sons of iron slew sons of iron. Question: why did the dispute of iron begin? Answer: some said resource scarcity. Some said doctrinal impurity. Some whispered that Perturabo grew tired of weakness and ordered his sons to test themselves to destruction, that only the strongest bastions and the hardest hearts would remain. Question: when did the dispute of iron end? Answer: it ended the moment the Primarch willed it. The guns fell silent. The survivors were counted. Those deemed wanting were cast out. The catechism ended, its vox glyphs dissolving into static. The Iron Warrior closed the file with a rasp of ceramite fingers and considered the words in the cold privacy of his helm. For him, the dispute of iron was not a line in a catechism, but memory. The thunder of siege guns firing inward, the sight of fortress spires collapsing like felled giants, the taste of propellant and dust in the air for long, unbroken years. When the first shells fell, Medrengard scarcely seemed to notice. The demon world had always shaken to the tread of titans and the detonation of artillery. On any given day, Manufactoria detonated in controlled tests, their structures sacrificed to prove new patterns of reinforcement or to appease bound warp entities. Slaves died in their thousands in test trenches and on proving grounds. The land itself was a patchwork of scars where citadels had risen and fallen over the long war. But there came a time, in the later centuries of the 34th millennium, when the pattern changed. Siege guns that had once spoken in unison against distant imperial bastions began to swing upon neighboring fortresses. Macro cannon traversed. Targeting spirits recalculated ranges. Vox traffic, once filled with firing data and the cold cant of bombardment, curdled into accusations and kill orders. Grand companies turned their engines upon each other. Within the steel valleys between Medrengard's citadels, titans strode out to meet their own kind. Hellish machines, each the size of a hive tower, clashed in duels that shattered slave cities beneath their feet. Volcano cannon and plasma annihilators spoke at point-blank range. Void shields flared and screamed and failed, shedding sparks like dying suns. When the god engines toppled, they crushed whole blocks of Manufactoria under their weight, spilling rivers of molten metal and burning slave flesh alike. Demon forges changed hands again and again. In the span of a few short decades, some forges were captured, recaptured, then captured again, their bound warp entities driven to rabid madness by the constant flux of masters and offerings. Dark Mechanicum adepts were crucified on their own gantries, or chained to their own cogitator thrones, forced to witness as rival warsmiths stripped their creations for parts. It was an internal war without front lines, a labyrinth of overlapping sieges and counter-sieges that chewed at the very bones of the demon world. Later chroniclers, Imperial and traitor alike, would name it the Dispute of Iron. To those who fought in it, it was simply the time when everything tried to kill everything else. In that chaos, one quarrel burned hotter than most. The warsmith called Garruk held a swathe of Medrengard's surface that had once been a range of mountains and was now a forest of fortress spires and bastion towers, each linked by networks of tunnels and tram lines. Garruk was an old thing, even by the standards of the 4th Legion, his flesh little more than a carrier for the iron that had replaced it. He believed in attrition as scripture. To him, a siege that did not last long enough to grind down both attacker and defender to bare, bleeding bone was an affront to Perturabo's teachings. When word reached him of a conclave of siege captains and line officers who favored faster wars and cleaner equations of destruction, his contempt was immediate and absolute. They were a contagion, he said, a deviation from the pure doctrine of the Legion. If they wish to be efficient, let them be efficient in dying. Those officers, the men who had begun to test drop assault spearheads and gunship thrusts instead of the old style of patient envelopment, were not cowed. They had seen too many campaigns lost because the 4th Legion had chained itself to sieges that outlasted their supply lines. They had watched fortress worlds slip back into Imperial hands as fresh reinforcements arrived, while Iron Warrior Grand Companies were still tearing down outer walls. They had calculated how many shells had been wasted in bombardments that could have been made far more precise. Their disagreement with Garruk began with words in strategium halls, with cold exchanges of data and doctrine. It ended with the targeting spirits of their guns being fed new firing solutions that led straight to Garruk's own bastions. When the first salvo from their macro batteries slammed into one of Garruk's outlying citadels, cracking its upper works open like a rotten egg, the Dispute of Iron crossed the point of no return. Garruk responded in kind. He was no fool. The men he scorned were still sons of Perturabo. Their calculations were sound, their guns accurate. He poured entire slave cohorts into counter-assaults, sent Titan maniples to pound their strongholds, directed the fire of his orbital platforms upon their mustering yards. The demon world groaned under the strain. Fortress spires that had stood for centuries toppled. Their falls shook the plains like earth shakes, sending tidal waves of dust and fractured ferrocrete across the slag deserts. Manufactoria detonated as ammunition dumps cooked off, their blast waves rolling outward in concentric circles of ruin. Warp storms boiled across the sky, drawn by the concentrated agony and hatred of so many warriors killing their own kind. The very air took on a metallic taste, as if the world itself were bleeding iron. In the midst of that furnace, the future Steel Brethren made their first defining theft. Garruk's primary armory lay beneath a mountain of reinforced rockcrete, girded about with void shield generators and defended by a lattice of interlocking gun emplacements. In quieter times, it had been a place where siege engines were born and perfected. Rows of artillery tanks, Predator variants, breacher vehicles, and super heavy platforms were fed down from production lines above on chains as thick as hab blocks. Among them, sealed within its own shrine vault, rested an infernal relic of the Great Crusade. It was a Land Raider Achilles, an already formidable pattern that had been reworked by Dark Mechanicum hands until its machine spirit had become something far less sane. Its hull was a mass of overlapping armor plates inscribed with wards and equations of force. Its primary weapons were siege melter blasts that could core through the heart of a bastion in a handful of strikes. It was the kind of engine that could turn the outcome of a siege by itself. In the chaos of the dispute, while Garruk's attention was fixed upon macro-scale engagements, the proto-warband moved. Under cover of a faint bombardment against one of the warsmith's peripheral fortresses, They inserted a spear of Terminator plate-clad veterans and tech adepts into the underworks of the mountain armory. They ghosted through maintenance tunnels and service ducts, cutting down servitor guardians and skirting around demon-bound defense turrets with the practiced ease of men who had been born in machine pits. When they reached the shrine vault of the Achilles, they did not pray. They hacked the locks, purged the guardian spirits, and imposed their own cipher sigils with brutal efficiency. The ancient tank stirred upon its clamps, engines growling like a caged beast scenting blood. Its machine spirit had been forged to serve iron and siege. It cared little whose heraldry adorned its hull, so long as it was allowed to break walls. They drove the relic straight through the inner gates of the armory. The Land Raiders' siege cannons spoke in thunder, tearing open bastion doors and collapsing fire positions before the defenders could rally. Behind it came squads of iron warriors in hazard-striped plate and burnished brass, bolters barking, chain blades shrieking against ceramite and flesh. The internal garrison died quickly, outmaneuvered and outgunned by their own kind who knew every angle of fire and every blind spot in the armory's defenses. By the time Garruk realized what had been done, the Achilles and a spearhead of other siege tanks had already smashed their way clear of the mountain and were racing across the slag plains toward the waiting embarkation caverns of their conspirator brothers. The warsmith's hatred when he beheld the empty cradle where his relic had once rested was something that could be tasted over the Vox. He named them traitors to the traitors. He marked the Grand Company that had dared to steal his engine for purge, declaring that no one who wore their colours would be spared. Kill orders were circulated to allied Iron Warriors formations. Any who gave them shelter would share their fate. The Proto-Steel Brethren did not waste time arguing. They answered with the language they understood best. They seized control of their nearest macro battery complexes, slaughtering or cowing the gunners who had once served them. Their warsmith, the man who would be called Iron Confessor and chain-forged and unyielding by those who only saw him through the smoke of battle, fed new coordinates into the targeting cogitators. The guns that had once guarded their bastions swung ponderously around, armor-plated barrels groaning and locked onto the silhouettes of their own fortresses. When the first salvo fell, it was like listening to a planet committing self-harm. Shells designed to pulverize imperial hive towers landed among the familiar lines of their own defenses. Walls disappeared in fountains of pulverized stone and steel. Gates that had repelled Orc war engines and loyalist tank columns were simply gone, reduced to spinning shards and clouds of dust. Men who had drilled for centuries to defend those positions died without ever understanding that the firing solutions that killed them had been calculated by their own brothers. In that sudden self-inflicted ruin, an escape corridor opened. The warsmith of the would-be Steel Brethren drove his stolen Land Raider through the wreckage at the head of a column of tanks and armored transports. Behind them rumbled artillery platforms chained into tow lines, dragged away from the shattered bastions that had once anchored their firing arcs. Overhead, gunships screamed low, their hulls scorched by flak, pouring suppressive fire onto any Iron Warrior who tried to regroup and block the retreat. Medrengard's surface cracked and burned around them. In the distance, whole fortress ranges toppled as other Grand Companies settled their own debts in macro, cannon fire. The sky above writhed with warp storms, oily swirls of unreality reflecting the internecine hatred below. For a moment, it seemed as if the demon world might devour itself entirely, its crust shattered by the very weapons its masters had forged. Then, as abruptly as a bolter slug removing a head, the dispute of iron ended. No one outside Perturabo's own circle ever learned exactly how the Primarch's will was made manifest. Some claimed that his image appeared upon every hololithic display in every fortress at once, his eyes burning with soul fire as he ordered the guns to fall silent. Others insisted that the world itself simply convulsed, a single resonant quake that snapped power conduits and overloaded Auspex arrays, crashing every targeting cogitator and cooling every macro barrel in the same moment. Whatever the mechanism, The effect was undeniable. Orders spread like a shockwave through the Vox. Ceasefire, stand to, count survivors. The internecine war was over. The test had been concluded. Those grand companies that had held their bastions against all comers were granted grim commendation. Those that had lost everything were scavenged for viable remnants and then erased. Some few, like the company of the stolen Achilles and the captured batteries, were not neatly filed into either category. They had proved too stubborn to die and too disobedient to keep. Perturabo's judgment was simple. Their colours were stricken from the rosters of the 4th Legion. Their name, such as it was branded Renegade. Their forges and manufactoria were reassigned. They were given a single choice: depart Medrengard under their own power and wage war in the galaxy beyond, or be broken beneath the combined might of all loyal grand companies. They chose exile. The Devastation-class cruiser Ferrum Invictus had once been a flagship in good standing, its launch bays filled with dropcraft and attack wings for orthodox siege operations. During the Dispute of Iron, it had suffered damage, its hull scarred, its machine spirit driven half-feral by conflicting orders and overloaded reactors. It lay in dock above one of the higher fortress spires, held in place by mag shackles and boarding towers, while Dark Mechanicum adepts laboured to placate its wrath. The renegade warsmith saw a home. His warriors stormed the docking bastions as calmly as if they were assaulting an enemy station. Void shield generators died under sabotaged power feeds. Dockyard gun emplacements fell silent under precision melter charges. The adepts at their consoles barely had time to grasp that the iron warriors at their backs were no longer allies before they were cut down or stunned and shackled to their own workstations. The Ferrum Invictus roared as they took control. Its engines, long throttled to idle, flared with murderous energy. Its machine spirit recognized the heraldry of the 4th Legion, tasted the data sigils of orchestrated siegecraft, and acquiesced. It did not care that those markings had been stricken from Medrengard's favor. It cared only that it would once more be allowed to rain fire upon fortresses. Up the embarkation gantries rolled the stolen Achilles and a score of other siege tanks. Train after train of ammunition carts clanked aboard, loaded with shells earmarked for campaigns that would now never be fought under Garrick's banner. Chains rattled as tech priests of the Dark Mechanicum were dragged up in iron collars and shock manacles, their mechadendrites bound, their altered flesh marked with fresh sigils declaring them property of the renegades. Their knowledge was too valuable to leave behind. When the last clamps failed and the final seals blew, the Ferrum Invictus tore itself free of its dock. Warning runes screamed in the control towers as the vast cruiser swung ponderously away from Medrengard's gravity well, its prow turning toward the bleeding stars. Batteries that had once guarded the approach debated opening fire, but the Primarch's edict stayed their hands. The renegades had chosen exile. To waste shells upon them was pointless. The warsmith stood upon the primary strategium deck as his new flagship ascended, surrounded by the silent ranks of his officers. Helms locked. Plate scarred by friendly and enemy fire alike. Men who had spent decades killing their own kind in the furnaces of Medrengard now looked out across a galaxy of fresh sieges. They were no longer merely another grand company of the Iron Warriors. Their colours had been cast out. Their name had been cursed, so they chose another. Steel brethren, the warsmith intoned, his voice a rasp of iron on iron. Brothers in iron, bound by siege and by calculation, owing allegiance not to a single warlord's pride, but to the pure logic of destruction. Steel brotherhood, whispered others, liking the taste of the words. It did not matter which name would be used in which tongue. The meaning was the same. They swore themselves to chaos undivided, as they had always done, offering not the babbling devotion of some berserkers or the sly piety of certain other legions, but the cold promise of worlds broken in the gods' names. They swore as well upon the memory of Perturabo, not as sons begging a father's forgiveness, but as artificers pledging to refine his craft until every fortress in the galaxy knew the precise moment it would fall. "Iron within, iron without," they said together, as the Ferrum Invictus slipped free of Medrengard's poisoned atmosphere and into the waiting warp. Centuries passed. The demon world turned, its scars from the dispute of iron layered over by new fortresses, new forges, new wars. In the Libraria of the Imperium, in the lightless vaults where forbidden data was collected and chained, a different kind of record slowly accreted. An imperial cartographer's file, compiled by weary adepts of the Navis Nobilitae and the Officio Logisticarum, listed a battle group of the 4th Legion known to have operated in certain segments during the earlier millennium. Names of vessels were given, among them the Ferrum Invictus. Notes in red ink marked a sudden cessation of sightings in the same era as the Dispute of Iron. Status: unconfirmed, presumed, destroyed. No reliable Auspex traces within Medrengard's cordoned volumes. Further down the file, newer entries bore the stain of unease. Fortress world fallen in a fraction of its projected endurance span. Garrison annihilated. Survivor accounts speak of ironclad traitor marines with hazard markings and a red halo badge. Attacker flagship silhouette bears resemblance to a Devastation-class cruiser of heretical configuration. Armory world overrun in record time. Siege tanks of archaic pattern recorded among the enemy spearheads, including a Land Raider variant with abnormal energy readings. No loyalist data on such a pattern. Possible infernal relic. Possible link to lost battle group. In the margins, a scribe with more imagination than was healthy had scrawled a single note before his superior struck it out. "They were never destroyed," he had written. "They were cast out. Now they have returned, and their iron remembers us." They called it Ferrum Invictus in the records that survived. The name meant iron unconquered, and there was savage pride in that choice. It had begun its existence as a Devastation-class cruiser in the days when the 4th Legion still fought beneath the eagle of the Emperor, a long, lean predator of the void, with cavernous launch bays and flanks bristling with weapon batteries. 10 millennia of betrayal and war had remade it into something far worse. Ferrum Invictus drifted through the warp like a great steel cathedral chained to a wounded god. Her hull was a patchwork of original armor and newer plates daubed in hazard stripes and litany script, all of it scarred by lance strikes and the caress of demons. Chains bound her from prow to stern, some purely symbolic, others hooked directly into the plated flesh of the thing that stirred in her reactors. Where once clean lines of imperial design had run along her flanks, now Baroque protrusions jutted outward like horns and teeth, studded with sensor veins and hellish icons. Her launch bays were open maws, each large enough to swallow a lesser warship whole. Within them crouched Hell Talons and other Chaos-spawned fighters, sleek and predatory under the dim lumen glow, their wings emblazoned with the broken eye and iron sigils of their masters. Gunships sat in ranks, heavy assault craft with armor thick enough to shrug off most ground fire, their hulls scabbed with welds from 100 campaigns. Drop pods hung from gantries and chains, their hulls scored by atmospheric entry burns, ready to be cut loose and hurled down upon whatever world lay beneath. The Ferrum Invictus was not merely a vessel. It was a roving fortress monastery, the steel heart of the Steel Brethren. Inside, the ship was a labyrinth of iron and flame. Forge decks sprawled along her spine, cavernous spaces where dark Mechanicum Magi chanted Binharic litanies over cauldrons of molten metal and demon-bound engines. These priests of the corrupted machine god were thin, spidery things, their flesh long since subsumed beneath augmetic limbs and serpentine mechadendrites. They rode with the Steel Brethren as parasite priests, tending to weapon systems and war engines in exchange for testbeds of cities and fortress worlds, where their creations could be proven in real blood. Servitor hordes shuffled through the forges in endless chains, their bodies little more than bone frameworks, encased in metal and wired into tool arrays. Stained skulls peered out from cages of brass, eyes long ago plucked and replaced with lenses and targeting optics. They carried shells, fed ammunition lifts, scrubbed grime from gun barrels, and marched into plasma leaks and radiation storms without complaint, for their minds had been stripped bare. Shrines to iron and entropy broke the monotony of pipes and conduits. In some, the brazen visage of Perturabo glowered from a wall of welded plate, his eyes picked out in baleful blue light. In others, more abstract icons of chaos undivided rose from piles of spent shell casings and bolter magazines, crude altarpieces daubed in dark, dried fluids. Warriors came here to lay broken auspex arrays or fragments of shattered armor at the shrine's feet, offerings to the gods of war and calculation. Ammunition holds ran like hollow bones through the ship's structure, stacked with siege shells in their millions. Massive macro cannon rounds rested in cradles of iron, each engraved with targeting data and curses, each destined for some bastion wall or bunker still standing in defiance. Smaller magazine spaces were crammed with racks of bolter shells, melter charges, breaching torpedoes, and the many other tools of siegecraft the Steel Brethren, regarded as sacraments. The alliance between the Warband and the Dark Mechanicum was intimate and old. Where other legions tolerated the Magi as necessary evils, the Steel Brethren saw them as essential, if distasteful, partners in the art of breaking fortresses. The tech priests rode the Ferrum Invictus like ticks on a predator beast, their data tendrils sunk deep into its veins. In return for keeping its ancient systems functioning, for coaxing demons into engines and convincing machine spirits to accept new masters, they were given cities to burn and worlds to dissect. For the Steel Brethren, a world was not simply a target, it was data. Every wall that fell, every bastion that cracked, every bunker that withstood more shells than predicted, all of it fed into the Warband's ledgers. The Dark Mechanicum recorded the numbers in their own fashion, translating human screams into pleasing sigils of waveform and code. Between them, they refined the equations of ruin. When the Ferrum Invictus made war, it did so according to carefully tested patterns. The ship did not translate from the warp directly into orbit above a target world, except in cases of extreme necessity or when surprise outweighed all other considerations. That kind of arrival was for berserkers and desperates. The Steel Brethren preferred something more measured. They would come in at the edges of a system, slipping from unreality into the chill dark, where Auspex coverage was thin and response times long. There they would lurk, reactors banked low, while their tech priests and warriors compiled everything they could from intercepted Vox traffic, long-range scans, and whatever records their agents had smuggled out in years past. Planetary defense grids were mapped, orbital station orbits were plotted. The firing arcs of defense platforms were extrapolated from idle training routines and from the occasional exercise shell flung out into the void. When the preparations were complete, the Ferrum Invictus advanced. Extreme range fire was their herald. Batteries designed to lay ruin upon planetary surfaces were turned upon orbital platforms and outer picket craft. Lances stabbed across gulfs of space, their beams invisible until they struck home in sudden flares of incandescent ruin. Macro cannon shells the size of hab blocks arced outward, their slow but unstoppable passage tracked by sweating Imperial gunnery crews who knew they did not have bays vomited. Hell Talons and gunships in bays vomited. Hell Talons and gunships in dark swarms, engines screaming as they knifed through the confusion. Behind them came drop pods hurled from their chains, their retros flaring as they bored into atmosphere, each a spear point aimed at a fortress or a command hub. The Steel Brethren did not waste troops on soft targets. Their initial assaults slammed into the planetary, crossed around priority fortresses, hive bastions, armory vaults, and vox spires. Gunships dropped iron warriors and their mortal auxiliaries on landing zones already softened by orbital fire, storming batteries and bastions that anchored the defense grid. Once planetside, the Warband applied their doctrine of concentric suffocation. First, they silenced the Vox. Vox relays and astropathic facilities were top targets. The Brethren understood too well the danger of Imperium reinforcements. They themselves had lost campaigns to the sudden arrival of fresh Imperial battle groups in ages past. Now they ensured that no such help would come. Relay towers were toppled. Astropath choirs were slaughtered to a man, their blood and Psychoner devices burned and buried. Emergency transmitters were either seized and used to transmit false assurances, or simply torn apart. Then they severed supply routes. Armor columns found their routes interdicted by sudden artillery storms. Troop convoys vanished into freshly made craters or were funneled into ambushes by deliberate destruction of road networks. Water processing plants and food storage sites were bombarded from orbit or shelled from captured artillery pieces until even well-stocked garrisons began to ration and hoard. Relief forces trying to reach besieged bastions discovered bridges gone, tunnels collapsed, rail lines twisted into molten knots. Only then did the Brethren tighten their artillery rings. They did not simply ring fortresses with guns and pound them at random. Each bastion was analysed, its likely weak points identified by men who had spent centuries building and breaking similar structures. Shell patterns were designed to stress particular walls, to collapse specific galleries, to bury escape tunnels and secondary entrances. They used barrage fire not merely to kill defenders, but to herd them, pushing them into areas of the fortress that were structurally unsound or tactically disadvantageous. Bunkers became tombs. Galleries became killing zones. Once a pocket was trapped, it could be ignored until the warband chose to collapse it or send in assault squads to finish the work. Within the Ferrum Invictus, siege patterns were not merely doctrine, but ritual. Hollow chambers hummed along certain decks, their walls lined with projectors and Auspex arrays slaved to cogitator banks. Here, warriors of the Steel Brethren gathered between campaigns, the glow of shifting tactical displays painting their hazard-striped plate in shades of ghostly green. Real Imperial fortress plans were loaded into the system, some stolen from captured data vaults, others reconstructed from surviving pict feeds and reports. The warband's officers would run simulation after simulation, testing bombardment patterns, assault vectors, and encirclement schemes. Failures were recorded with the same cold thoroughness as successes. When a particular pattern resulted in overlong sieges, excessive losses, or inefficient ammunition expenditure, its identifier code was carved into an armor plate ripped from the Ferrum Invictus's inner hull. These plates were then hauled in solemn procession down to the outer skin of the ship and welded on as patches of shame. To walk the maintenance galleries that ran between outer armor and inner structure was to walk a history of failure. Each burned and scarred plate bore lines of script detailing which fortress had resisted, how long, at what cost, and why. The effect upon a warrior standing there in the dim light, the distant vibration of the guns thrumming through his boots, was not one of contrition in any human sense. It was a promise that such waste would not be tolerated again. Mortal auxiliaries and slaves moved through this world of iron like shadows at the feet of giants. They were pressed into service from conquered worlds, chain-bound in packs and herded into barracks carved from unused torpedo bays or hollowed-out fuel tanks. There they slept in, their armor when they were lucky enough to have any, and on bare grating when they were not. They knew better than to hope for mercy or reward. The Steel Brethren did not bargain with them, did not offer lies of emancipation or advancement. The only currency they acknowledged for mortals was usefulness. Those deemed suitably robust and cowed were used as trench diggers and entrenchment crews, shipped down to war zones ahead of the main assaults to gouge lines in the earth under the watchful gaze of Iron Warrior overseers. Ammunition porters staggered beneath the weight of shells and fuel canisters, hurrying between rear lines and gun positions while enemy fire scythed overhead. Others were sent ahead of advancing Brethren lines across suspected minefields, their frantic steps clearing safe paths at the cost of their own lives. For some, the only difference between a quick execution and prolonged suffering was how many orders they obeyed before they inevitably broke. On one mid-hive, Bastion whirled. In the galactic north, whose name hardly matters now, the Steel Brethren provided a grim demonstration of their methods. Imperial tacticians had predicted that the world, with its ring of fortified hive cities and a central bastion complex dug into the crust, could hold out for many years under conventional siege. Its walls were thick, its void shields strong, its garrisons well drilled. Its commanders, eager to test their mettle, spoke of wearing down any attacker in a long, glorious defense. The Ferrum Invictus arrived in that system as a shadow on distant Auspex scopes, a contact dismissed at first as a ghost echo. By the time the defense monitors understood what they were seeing, extreme range fire was already streaking in. Defense platforms died in bright blooms of ruin. Orbital stations went dark, their lights winking out one by one as lances cored their reactors. Steel Brethren gunships descended into the resulting confusion, and drop pods slammed into the crust in a rain of fire. They did not attempt to storm the outer walls of the mid-hive bastions head-on. Instead, their first thrusts took them to the industrial zones and transport hubs buried beneath the hive stacks, to the maintenance tunnels and support galleries that honeycombed the bedrock. Grav drills, vast machines stolen from mining worlds and refitted in the forges of the Ferrum Invictus, were brought down in segments and reassembled in echoing caverns. Melter charge teams clambered along newly cut shafts, their armor scorched by reflected heat as they planted charges upon the underside of bastion foundations. Above, the defenders fired down at empty trenches and gaped at the crack and groan of stressed masonry. Weeks, not years. The first bastion's walls collapsed inward when its foundation finally gave way, entire sections of the hive sliding into a hollowed void beneath. Machine shrieks and human screams merged into a single roar of destruction. The defenders, suddenly deprived of their outer shell, were left scrambling through choking dust clouds even as artillery shells began to fall in carefully measured patterns, driving them toward pre-selected kill zones. Other bastions followed. Some tried to sally out, their armor columns running straight into pre-sighted kill lanes, where Brethren guns turned the ground into a crater field. Others hunkered down and prayed, only to find their water supplies poisoned, their air recyclers clogged with ash and debris. Vox pleas for aid went unanswered. The relays had been silenced early in the campaign. In less than a season, the world that had been expected to resist for decades was ash and rubble. Its hives were broken stumps, its bastions were craters. Its name was scratched from Imperial charts and replaced with a red sigil, denoting a world that might one day be reclaimed, but not soon. The Steel Brethren did not exult. They took readings. They recorded the time to collapse of each bastion, the tonnage of shells expended, the percentage of their own casualties taken in each phase of the siege. They noted how quickly the garrison's morale crumbled once supply lines were severed, how long isolated pockets continued to fight without reinforcement, how effective certain atrocity patterns were in encouraging surrender versus prolonging resistance. For them, terror and attrition were not ends in themselves. They were tools. A massacre that cost more ammunition than it was worth, that hardened enemy resolve rather than breaking it, would be noted as inefficient and consigned to the shame plates welded to the Ferrum Invictus's hull. An atrocity that induced a key officer to betray a gate code, or induced an entire garrison to mutiny and hand over a bastion intact, would be preserved and refined for use elsewhere. Nothing was done simply for cruelty's sake. Cruelty that did not lead to a tactical advantage was indulgence, and the Steel Brethren prided themselves upon their lack of indulgence. In the dark years that followed, as the long war dragged on, and fortress after fortress fell in places far from Medrengard, certain inquisitors began to notice a recurring shape. Void hollows taken from desperate ships moments before their destruction, Auspex snaps from dying defense monitors, picked frames salvaged from half-melted data cores. All of them showed the same silhouette at the edge of the ruin. A lean predatory cruiser with a prow like a ramming spike, and broad flanks studded with weapon moors. Launch bays gaping, gun decks blazing, hazard-striped plating catching the light of burning worlds. In the marginalia of more than one tactical dossier, a tired inquisitorial scribe had penned the same observation. "Wherever that shadow sails, bastions die," he wrote. before drawing his quill through the words at his master's order. It is as if the machine itself remembers every fortress it has ever broken and has come to remind the next one of its place in the ledger of iron. They called it a siege, as if the word were enough to contain it. In the grim annals of the 41st millennium, where entire campaigns vanished into the background noise of eternal war, the struggle for Vrax Prime still stood out like a suppurating wound. It began in the 813th year of that age, when the Departamento Munitorum armory world of Vrax Prime rose in rebellion under the apostate Cardinal Zafan and threw its vast stockpiles of shells and tanks into the service of the ruinous powers. It ended in the 830th, when the Ordo Malleus wrote the world off as lost and ordered the ruin cordoned, its soil poisoned, its population annihilated. Between those dates lay 17 standard years of trench warfare, massed artillery and attrition so absolute that maps had to be redrawn daily to account for the shifting contours of shell craters and bone fields. Vrax Prime was an armory world, and that meant fortification. Kilometers of bunkers and gun emplacements honeycombed its surface. Ammunition depots hunkered beneath armored mantles of rockcrete and adamantium. Vox spires and defense laser mounts rose like broken teeth along the horizons of its scarred plains.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
Before the uprising, these works had served the Imperium, feeding shells and armored columns into 100 war zones. After the Cardinal's betrayal, they became a fortress complex turned inward, all its guns now aligned against the servants of the throne. For the Steel Brethren, it was the perfect canvas. An entire world built on the same principles they had learned upon Medrengard. Every bunker was a problem in stress and yield. Every trench network was a series of equations in angle and overlapping fire. Every magazine was a potential sympathetic detonation waiting to be coaxed into existence. Where other warbands might have seen a charnel pit in the making, the Steel Brethren saw a grand experiment in siegecraft. When Arcos the Faithless sent the call out through the warp, summoning warbands to join him in the butchery, the Steel Brethren answered. They were not alone. Vrax was a beacon for the damned, the faithless of the Alpha Legion, the skull-marked butchers of the World Eaters, plague-rotted sons of the Death Guard. Black Legionnaires come to spill blood in their master's name, nameless renegades and Titan legions in thrall to gods of ruin. All of them were drawn into the maelstrom. By the height of the war, no fewer than 11 distinct warbands of the damned trod Vrax mud and ash under Ceramite boots. In orbit, the Ferrum Invictus took its place among a loose cordon of heretic vessels. Some were hulking battleships bearing icons of the Eye and 8-pointed star, others lesser cruisers and repurposed merchant hulks heavy with stolen ordnance. The Devastation-class cruiser that served as the Steel Brethren's fortress monastery hung back from the immediate knot of conflict, its reactor wash. Low, its launch bays closed for the moment. It lurked like a steel carrion bird above a world already wreathed in shellfire and toxic cloud cover, its auger arrays feeding on the data vomited by the war below. Vrax had already been burning for years when the Brethren arrived. The Krieg regiments of the 88th Siege Army had dug, marched, died, and dug again across a landscape of trench lines and bunkers that stretched from horizon to horizon. Millions of shells had fallen. Millions of men had vanished into the mud. And still the citadel at the heart of the armory complex stood defiant behind its rings of defense. The Steel Brethren came not as saviors, not as lords to claim primacy over Arcos's campaign, but as specialists. Their role was precise. While other warbands hurled themselves into frontal assaults or prowled the no-man's land, hunting for skulls and slaves, the Brethren set about coordinating deep strike assaults and gunship landings against key bastions, anchoring the Vraxian line. From the strategium decks of Ferrum Invictus, they studied maps of the fortress rings, identifying strongpoints where Imperial counter-assaults had previously broken, bastions whose fields of fire overlapped too well, Vox spires whose continued existence made coordinated defense possible. Then they cut. Steel-colored gunships punched through the choking clouds, engines wailing as they jinked through the erratic flak put up by Vraxian guns. Drop pods screamed in their wake, each one a falling star that ended in a thunder of impact against some hardened redoubt. Breach charges and melter beams followed, opening wounds in the armory world's outer works. Where a bastion's guns had once raked no man's land, now its casemates burned and its parapets were choked with broken bodies and hazard-striped figures raising the twin halo sigil. In their wake came others. World eaters in red and brass armor surged into the gaps, chain axes howling as they turned kill zones into personal arenas of slaughter. Renegade guardsmen flooded forward in ragged ranks, their laser guns and stolen tanks taking advantage of the collapsed bastions to pour deeper into trench lines that had once seemed impregnable. Plague-ridden warriors came too, oozing contagion into bunkers and dugouts, their own methods of siegecraft measured in coughing fits and the collapse of lungs rather than the fall of walls. The Steel Brethren did not concern themselves with the theology of it. They opened the way, others filled it with blood. All the while, their attention was fixed upon Vrak's armoured assets. This was an armoury world, after all. Its vaults and storage yards were heavy with tanks, artillery pieces, siege platforms, and exotic engines that had never yet seen battle beyond this blasted soil. Many had been seized by the Vraxian renegades and turned against the Imperium. Others remained sealed in bunkers that had not yet fallen. The Brethren hunted them, with a collector's focus. Where their spearheads broke through to armor parks and depot vaults, their first instinct was not to torch everything. Enough fuel tanks would burn, enough ammunition stacks would cook off by accident. What they sought were the rare patterns: heavy artillery carriages with unusual recoil compensation arrays, super heavy tanks with reinforced siege mantles, old pattern breacher vehicles whose chassis hinted at superior stress tolerances. These they marked. Captured depots were swiftly cordoned off from the general chaos of the war zone. Iron warriors in the steel and black of the Brethren stood at their edges, weapons levelled, and turned away even Cornete berserkers, with the promise of shells in the back if they pressed the matter. Dark Mechanicum adepts slithered in to appraise the prizes, canting in praise to machine spirits gone feral from years of neglect. Those engines deemed worthy were patched up, fueled and crewed, either by hand-picked auxiliaries or by bound servitor brains. When the warp tides permitted, when the Ferrum Invictus could risk lowering herself to the margins of the planet's gravity well and opening her great beast maw of a launch bay, such prizes were spirited off-world. Tank columns rolled up embarkation ramps under covering fire, their engines snarling, their hulls still caked in Vraxian mud and the residue of Imperial paint schemes. Siege platforms were dragged aboard on chains to be refitted and reassigned to future wars where their strengths could be exploited with Brethren precision. Not every prize could be saved. Many were expended on Vrax itself, turned against their former owners in vicious artillery duels, or used as spearheads for pushes into the inner defense lines. But those that survived became part of the Steel Brethren's growing private arsenal, each one another tool in their ledger of iron. Imperial commanders, watching their maps and casualty reports from the relative safety of rear command dugouts, began to notice a pattern. There were sectors of the front where trenches did not merely fall, they imploded. Lines that had been stable for months, that had weathered attacks by traitor militia and berserker assaults with horrific but predictable loss ratios, suddenly collapsed in upon themselves in a matter of days. Reports from those fronts spoke of carefully calibrated bombardments that cut communication trenches first, then ammunition depots, then dugouts. Survivors described kill zones that seemed to spring into existence around them, interlocking arcs of heavy bolter and autocannon fire that left no line of retreat. Attempts to reinforce such sectors found access routes cratering under shellfall the moment they were used. It was as if someone had drawn a noose on the tactical map and then tightened it, one shell pattern at a time. Vox intercepts and shell fragment analysis, when cross-checked against fragmentary picked captures of advancing enemy forces, revealed the common factor: steel-colored armor, hazard striping, a badge of interlocked red halos on a black field. In the segments of Vrax where that heraldry appeared, the trench systems behaved less like battlefields and more like slaughterhouses designed to pen livestock for orderly killing. Vrax was a proving ground worthy even of the Steel Brethren's ruthless standards, but it extracted a toll. The warband had fought in long sieges before. They were born of Maedrengard's furnaces and had carved their identity in the dispute of iron. They were no strangers to campaigns measured in years. Yet even by their expectation, Vrax was a grinding horror. Artillery duels raged day and night. The Ferrum Invictus hammered at the surface from orbit when the warp storms allowed it, its macro cannon shells coming down like slow meteors, while Vraxian defense guns spat back defiance until their barrels ran hot and warped. On the ground, Steel Brethren batteries and Imperial field pieces engaged in duels where the only way to spot the enemy was to watch for the flicker of muzzle flash through toxic fog and the brief silhouette of a gun shield before the next shell fell. Assaults were measured in meters of muddy ground, gained at appalling cost. Brethren warriors advanced through clouds of dust and shrapnel, vision reduced to flickering Auspex readouts and the crackle of squad vox, trusting in their armor and the cold mathematics of covering fire. Mortals pressed into their service died in dense ranks in front of them, throwing themselves into tank traps, wire and minefields to clear paths. Demons were unleashed in certain sectors, boiling up from summoning pits to tear at trenches already half destroyed by shelling. But even they could not hold ground for long under the constant rain of steel. The Steel Brethren endured because endurance was their nature. But their mortal auxiliaries were burned through at a prodigious rate, entire cohorts erased in single pushes. Even their demon engines began to show the strain, their plated hides cracked and pitted, their bound entities sullen from overuse. The war gave them data and experience in abundance. It also consumed resources they could ill afford to waste, even for a prize as rich as Vrax. When the end came, it did so in a frenzy of demonic incursion and purgation, beyond even the Brethren's appetite. The Imperium, pushed beyond its patience by the sheer cost in blood and time, unleashed the Ordo Malleus in full. Grey Knights strode the trenches, their silvered armor anathema to the warp entities that had begun to seep into reality across the Vraxian front. Inquisitor lords invoked exterminatus-level measures for entire sectors, burning plague pits and demon-haunted bunkers alike in tides of holy fire. Titans of the Collegia Titanica advanced through the ruin, their god machines bellowing catechisms as they crushed corrupted bastions beneath adamantine feet. In the confusion of that final cataclysm, records blurred. Imperial fleet logs note the presence of numerous heretic vessels in the system during the last assaults upon the Citadel. Among them, the battleship Anarchy's Heart of the Faithless. Auspex transcripts detail its destruction at the guns of loyalist battle barges, its wrecked hull vanishing into the warp as it died. No such certainty attends the Ferrum Invictus. In some accounts, the steel-hulled Devastation-class cruiser had already broken from orbit by then, vanishing into the Empyrean with holds full of stolen armor and dark mechanicum spoils, its masters satisfied with the data and engines they had wrung from the campaign. In others, the Ferrum Invictus is listed among the vessels trapped when the Ordo Malleus tightened the cordon, its last known auger trace fading amid the debris clouds of shattered traitor hulls. Some Imperial savants, laboring centuries later over incomplete logs and conflicting testimonies, mark the Steel Brethren as presumed shattered on Vrax. They point to the sheer intensity of the final phase, to the number of warbands known with certainty to have perished there, Arcos among them, and argue that no rational enemy commander would have remained in system once the Inquisition's full weight was brought to bear. Others dissent. They note later sieges where fortress worlds fell too quickly, where defenders spoke of steel-grey traitors whose methods matched those used on Vrax. They highlight void hollows of a familiar silhouette at the edge of battlescapes, far from the Scarus sector, a Devastation-class cruiser whose hull markings and launch patterns echo those recorded by Krieg Auspec's officers in the long years of the Vraxian campaign. To them, the idea that the Steel Brethren died on Vrax is wishful thinking dressed up as analysis. In the end, the truth is buried under ash and interdiction orders. On Vrax itself, nothing living remains to testify. Only skulls, trenches, now filled with dust, and the occasional scrap of iron-bearing hazard striping, half buried in the mud of a world declared perdu. One such scrap turned up in the hand of an inquisitorial archivist centuries after the war, fused to the remains of a Vox unit salvaged from a collapsed dugout. The unit's memory crystals had been half melted, their data corrupted beyond most machines' ability to recover. Under patient care and the application of more than a little forbidden law, a single fragment of recording was coaxed back into coherence. The voice on the Vox was hoarse, masked by the howl of distant artillery. It belonged to one of the gun crews of Vrax, an artilleryman whose name history had long since lost. Sector 46 line is gone. They came through the mud like they owned it, steel and black, with the hazard stripes like warning chevrons on their plates. Our shells fall right on them, and they keep coming, stepping over craters that swallowed whole squads. They advance like they already know where every shot will land. We tried to swing the guns. Orders came down to reverse the batteries, fire point blank into the trench they took. But by the time we got the breech blocks loaded, they were already there, on us. They did not shout. They did not roar. They just moved, methodical, like they were adjusting firing solutions. I saw one look up as a shell burst just above him. The shrapnel sparked off his armor. He did not flinch. He just raised his bolter and kept walking. The horizon is burning. The sky is gone. The trenches ahead of us have folded in, like someone scooped them out of the ground. The lieutenant says, "Hold the line." I do not think there is a line left to hold. If anyone hears this, if anyone ever hears this, if they tell you the Steel Ones died here, do not believe them. Iron does not die in mud like this. It learns. It remembers. They are coming closer now. I have to. The recording ended there. The last few syllables cut off by a spike of interference that might have been a shell burst or a Vox spirit finally surrendering to the demands of entropy. The archivist filed it away with a note identifying the Steel Brethren as suspects. On Vrax, as on Medrengard, as on every other fortress world they touched, the Ledger of Iron had claimed another entry. The Steel Brethren are siege masters. That truth must be understood before any attempt is made to catalogue their campaigns, for every act they commit in war is shaped by that identity. Where other servants of the dark gods hurl themselves into battle in storms of rage or self-indulgent sorcery, the Brethren advance with the implacable patience of collapsing masonry. They are the inheritors of the Fourth Legion's art, but they have pared even that ruthless legacy down to its sharpest edge. In their hands, mathematical attrition has been elevated to a kind of iron liturgy. To an outside observer, their wars begin not with the hot thunder of guns, but with silence. Long before the first shell is fired, the Steel Brethren enter their pre-assault phase. From the strategium decks of the Ferrum Invictus, they conduct auger sweeps that reach from the outer system all the way down to the crust of the target world. Vox intercepts, Auspex ghosts, the faintest energy signatures from hidden bunkers, all are fed into the warband's cogitator banks. Dark Mechanicum Magi spread data sigils across hololithic projectors, chanting Binharic formulae as they perform their data screes. No fragment of information is too small to be harvested. A minor power fluctuation at a remote relay station, the cadence of a garrison's training cycles, an idle transmission from a supply convoy, all are noted, weighed and extrapolated. From this harvest of numbers and murmurings, they compile structural stress maps of every significant fortification upon the world below. To the Steel Brethren, a bastion is not merely a wall and some guns. It is a web of load-bearing struts, galleries, void shield nodes, and buried power lines. They trace the flow of force through those structures as a savant might trace ink lines upon parchment. They identify weak points, where a single void shield generator overload will cascade through an entire defense grid, or where the collapse of one sublevel corridor will drag whole curtain walls down into the earth. Their goal is simple. They search for the exact points where minimal bombardment will produce maximal collapse, and they find them. When the time comes to strike, the first blow is rarely a full encirclement. That is how the 4th Legion once fought when they still obeyed the throne. The Steel Brethren prefer to pierce rather than to smother. Mixed waves of drop pods and gunships form the spear point. The pods are hurled from their chains in the launch bays of Ferrum Invictus, their retros burning bright as they plunge through atmosphere toward their selected coordinates. Gunships tumble after them, their engines roaring, their armored hulls shedding fire in sheets. These are not random spearheads hurled toward the nearest walls. Each pod and each craft carries a squad whose loadout was chosen for a particular target identified in the pre-assault phase. Some squads carry melter charges and heavy demolition packs, their armor scarred from countless close-range breaches. Others bring breaching drills, compact but brutally powerful machines whose spinning teeth can chew through rockcrete and adamantium alike. There are heavy weapon teams armed with lascannons and missile launchers to silence specific gun nests and anti-armor positions. All of them are shepherded into their landing zones by auger feeds and cogitator guidance, riding down corridors of calculated risk where the chance of catastrophic interception is small enough to be acceptable. They land not upon the strongest outer walls, but in the arteries behind them. Drop pods smash into courtyards, onto gun deck roofs, into access yards that lead to void shield generators and control bunkers. Their ramps blow out into storms of dirt and shrapnel, and hazard-striped giants stride forth, bolters spitting the first measured volleys of the siege. Gunships disgorge squads into half-prepared strongpoints, their heavy weapons already swinging toward the targets identified for them in the data maps. Within moments, interior corridors that the defenders once considered secure are filled with the crack of bolter fire and the roar of melter charges. The aim of these initial strikes is not to capture whole fortresses, it is to gut defense nodes from within. Void shields flicker and die as generator housings are breached and their mechanisms ruined. Command bunkers fall silent as their occupants are executed amid flickering lumen strips and sparking hololiths. Fire control centers are overrun, their cogitator banks smashed or simply redirected to obey new masters. In some cases, it is enough merely to sever certain bundles of power and data cabling, to collapse particular stairwells or galleries, to make sure that when the wider bombardment begins, the bastion can no longer coordinate its own salvation. Once such nodes are in their grasp, the Steel Brethren turn to one of the patterns that most clearly distinguishes them. They weaponize the defender's own walls. A captured macro-cannon bastion is not an objective to be held for its own sake. It is a tool to be turned immediately against neighboring redoubts. Tech adepts of the Dark Mechanicum and Iron Warrior gunners work side by side to retask targeting spirits, overwrite range tables, and apply fresh firing solutions. Firing apertures that once spat shells out toward the invaders now belch death inward upon trenches and fortifications aligned to receive support, not enmity, from that angle. Loyalist lines are forced to cannibalize themselves under their own guns, defenders watching in dawning horror as familiar. Bastions suddenly become executioners. The engineering support that makes such feats possible is formidable. Demon-bound siege engines of many patterns stalk the battlefields under the Brethren's command. Some are corrupted equivalents of Imperial artillery platforms, their gun barrels fused with writhing flesh, their recoil compensators reinforced by warp-borne musculature. Others are more exotic engines birthed entirely in the forges of Medringard and the hellish workshops aboard Ferrum Invictus, machines whose shapes were never sanctioned by the Mechanicum of Mars. All share one trait. Their presence allows the Steel Brethren to apply extreme force precisely where it is required. Specialized vehicles form the backbone of their armored spearheads. Many are modeled on patterns once used proudly by the 4th Legion in Loyalist days, now twisted into infernal relics. Land Raider variants with thickened frontal armor and siege mantles advance under storms of fire, their hulls adorned with wards and hazard striping. Some of these engines can trace their machine spirits back to the age of the Great Crusade. Dark Mechanicum rights have layered new hungers and hatreds over those ancient cores, teaching them to delight in the sound of cracking stone and tearing steel. With such tools, the Steel Brethren do not simply batter fortresses. They take them apart along lines of stress and force, as a surgeon might disassemble a body. Their doctrine extends beyond the physical, into the minds of those trapped behind the walls. Psychological warfare is not an afterthought for them. It is woven into the bombardment schedule from the first salvo. Timed shelling denies sleep cycles, driving garrison commanders to exhaustion and fraying the nerves of line troops. Batteries will fall silent for long stretches, lulling defenders into brief, shaky rest, only to erupt without pattern or mercy the moment men begin to close their eyes. The sound of siege guns becomes a language, in itself a constant background growl punctuated by unexpected hammer blows that keep hearts racing and tempers raw. Water is cut wherever possible. The Brethren have long since learned that thirst breaks men faster than hunger. Air recyclers in hab blocks and deep bunkers are targeted with surgical strikes or sabotage raids, leaving survivors choking in stale atmosphere. Escape tunnels and emergency galleries, so carefully constructed by Imperial engineers, are located and collapsed with shaped charges or precisely aimed artillery. The result is a garrison trapped in lightless bunkers, choking on dust, listening to the monotonous thud of shells overhead for week after week. Under such conditions, men crack. They desert their posts and flee into kill zones in the hope that any other position must be better than the one they currently occupy. They turn on their officers in mutinies born as much of claustrophobia as of fear. They throw down weapons when faced with the blank visors of hazard-striped giants who seem to know exactly how much longer the walls will stand. Every effect is tested, recorded, and refined. The Steel Brethren maintain an internal record of their wars that they call, in their private speech, the Ledger of Iron. It is more than a simple log of victories and defeats. Each siege is scored according to criteria that would make an Imperial Commissar blanch. Ammunition expenditure is tallied down to the last shell. Time to breach is measured not merely in days, but in projected days versus actual days. Surviving enemy strength is compared to initial estimates. Levels of collateral ruin are assessed against stated objectives, with needless destruction marked as waste rather than glory. Any deviation from efficiency is punished. On Ferrum Invictus, rituals are held not only to praise successful campaigns, but to excoriate failures. Officers whose projections proved significantly inaccurate are called before their peers in shrine decks dense with incense and the smell of machine oil. There, beneath the stern visages of iron icons, they are made to account for every miscalculation. Punishments range from the symbolic, such as the chiseling of their names into shame plates welded to the outer hull, to the brutally physical, like in forced service in the most exposed forward observation posts of the next campaign. The Steel Brethren do not tolerate sloppy war. Their view of civilians and non-combatants follows the same chill logic. To berserkers, unarmed populations are either targets for immediate slaughter or irrelevant. To the Steel Brethren, civilians are pressure values in the equations of siege. In some cases, they are penned within certain districts and allowed to starve, their dwindling numbers charted against the impact upon garrison morale. In others, they are driven in terror toward Imperial lines, herded by shell bursts and burning hab blocks into the open, where their panicked flight clogs trench systems and overwhelms ration schemes. There are times when burying whole populations beneath rubble is judged the most economical course. A hab level whose inhabitants cannot be used as leverage, whose continued existence would consume shells to police and food to placate, may simply be dropped. A handful of carefully placed charges at key structural points, or a concentrated bombardment from siege mortars, will see the problem resolved under meters of shattered rockcrete. No hate is involved in such decisions. There is only arithmetic. Compared to other warbands of chaos, the Steel Brethren stand apart in their approach. The warriors of the World Eaters favor frontal slaughter, hurling themselves against defenses in bloody waves, trading their own lives freely for the visceral satisfaction of close combat. The Night Lords practice terror raids, their aim to break worlds through fear before the first shot is even fired, their trophies serving as messages carved in living flesh and flickering lumen script across the night sky. The Death Guard wage slow wars of rot and despair, exulting in the drawn-out agony of plagues and the inevitability of decay. The Steel Brethren respect all these methods as data points, but they do not emulate them. To them, war is not a frenzy or a theatre. It is an equation with a single correct answer. A fortress stands. Then, by application of precise force and controlled suffering, it does not. The route taken between those two states should be as direct and economical as possible, because anything else is a betrayal of Perturabo's creed, no matter how loudly his name is shouted while walls crumble. To face the Steel Brethren is to be condemned in advance. By the time their heraldry is seen upon the horizon or upon the augur scopes of a beleaguered fleet, the calculations that will decide a fortress's fate have already been made. Somewhere in the data vaults of Ferrum Invictus, a number is written beside the name of the world and its bastions. That number marks the projected hour of collapse. Perhaps it will be wrong by a small margin. Perhaps the defenders will hold a little longer than predicted, or fail more quickly than expected. But the Brethren will adjust. They will refine their formulae, update their ledger, and move on. They are patient executioners, not ravaging beasts. They stride through bombardment that would kill anything human, advancing with the certainty of falling blocks in some immense and ancient trap. When at last they stand upon the shattered parapets and look down upon the ruin of the garrison, they already know how much must be left intact for the next world to see. A half-fallen bastion here, a field of cracked gun shields there, a single raised banner amid a sea of corpses, all carefully preserved as warnings. The fortress dies. The lesson endures. The Steel Brethren march on to apply it elsewhere. In the present age of the Imperium, the name of the Steel Brethren appears in those places, where ink is darkest and seals are most numerous. In the Cyclopean vaults of the Ordo Astartes, there exists a classification slate, its edges worn smooth by gauntleted hands, upon which the warband is listed in precise but uneasy script. Origin: the 4th Legion. Iron Warriors. Allegiance: Chaos Undivided. Strength: Unknown. Status: Mobile Siege Asset. Threat Designation: High, with particular emphasis upon Bastion worlds and Armory planets. The accompanying addendum is brief and bleak. Fortresses that should stand for decades fall in a handful of weeks where the Steel Brethren march. Their presence is to be considered a sign that any defense line, no matter how meticulously planned, is living on borrowed time. It is not a single battle that has earned them this dread reputation, nor even a single campaign such as the long butchery of Vrax. It is a scatter of reports across subsectors and centuries, fragmentary accounts in 100 archives that, when laid side by side, form a pattern. A fortress world in the northern marches, its walls praised by imperial architects as masterpieces of layered defense, surrenders rubble and ash to the void in a span so short that the Departamento Munitorum's projections are rendered farcical. A ring-world bastion in the eastern reaches, its defense grid considered flawless and its garrison fanatical, is found gutted from the inside out, its own bastions turned upon one another. In the after-action reports of these disasters, among the litany of failures and excuses, certain details repeat. Steel-coloured armour, hazard striping like warning chevrons upon the shoulders and knees, a badge of interlocked red halos on a black field, siege guns that seem to know exactly where to speak. In some of those records, the witnesses never see the traitors with their own eyes. They are artillery officers who note peculiar shell patterns from the enemy lines, infantry sergeants who notice that every attempt to reinforce a particular, Bastion ends in the same carefully placed bombardment. Others are less fortunate. Surviving Pict captures freeze-frame the silhouettes of transhuman killers advancing through dust and shrapnel. Bolters steady, movements precise, unhurried, even as the world collapses around them. In one sequence, a group of steel-colored giants in hazard-striped plate stands upon a captured battlement, their figures limned by the fire of burning hab blocks below. They do not raise their weapons in exultation. They simply turn in unison toward the next bastion, as if following a line only they can see. Alongside such images come reports of dark Mechanicum contingents and demon engines, whose machine spirits carry signatures recognizable to those who have studied the forges of Medrengard and the engines unleashed upon Vrax. Certain patterns of corrupted artillery platform, certain super-heavy siege tanks bearing wards and weld scars identical to those recorded centuries earlier appear again and again. Credit is due to those few adepts of the Mechanicus who have dared to compare such data across time and warzone. Their conclusions strengthen the argument that at least a core of the Steel Brethren endured the furnace of Vrax and simply moved on, their engines repaired, their ledgers enriched, their hate undiminished. Within the shattered brotherhood of the Iron Warriors themselves, the Steel Brethren occupy an ambiguous place. There are warsmiths who spit oaths when their name is spoken, recalling the dispute of iron upon Medrengard and the theft of engines, such as the infernal Achilles pattern Land Raider from their own forges. To those lords, the Brethren are exiles and thieves, carrion crows who turned their guns upon their kin and fled the judgment of Perturabo. They speak of contracts broken and of armory vaults stripped, of decades of careful hoarding undone in a single night by hazard-striped raiders who knew every access code and firing arc. Others among the 4th Legion are more pragmatic. They remember that the long war is not a thing to be won by pride alone. For such warsmiths, doctrine matters more than old insults. They have watched bastion worlds fall to the Brethren's patterns and privately acknowledged their brutal purity. When Iron Sons make war upon Iron Sons, when rival warbands contest fortress stations and demon forges, these lords have been known to seek out the Steel Brethren as hired specialists. Payment is counted not in slaves or spoils, but in rights of first choice over particular sections of wall, over particular bastions, whose breaking will add rich data to the ledger of iron. In response to these shadowed campaigns, the fortress worlds of the Imperium have adapted as best they can. Adeptus Astartes and Imperial Fist's successor chapters, schooled in the arts of defense, have revised their manuals in light of Vrax and other disasters. Orbital drop assault has become a prime fear, void shields are layered and overlapping more than ever, and no bastion is now considered complete without countermeasures specifically designed to swat incoming pods and gunships from the sky. Decoy bunkers are constructed, their interiors empty or filled with sacrificial stores, deliberately presented to augur spirits as more vital than they are. Void shield nodes and command galleries are buried deeper, their access points multiplied and concealed. Kill squads are raised and drilled with a singular purpose, the hunting of dark Mechanicum Magi. These teams, drawn from stormtrooper cadres, veteran guardsmen and in some cases Astartes brethren, are trained to recognize the spore of corrupted tech priests and to strike at them in close confines. They are given priority transport and kept on constant readiness, for once the Steel Brethren's priests gain access to a defense grid or a bastion's machine spirits, reversal of that contamination becomes dubious at best. Better to murder the magus and amputate the infected section of the grid than to let the sickness spread. In the scolums where the philosophies of war are still taught without complete despair, the Steel Brethren are sometimes held up as an object lesson in what the creed of Perturabo becomes when followed without pity. The Primarch of the 4th Legion taught that war was the crucible in which worth was proven, that fortifications were not only shields, but tests. A fortress that could not withstand everything that could be brought against it did not deserve to stand. A commander who could not hold such a fortress did not deserve command. In the hands of the Brethren, that creed has shed even the thin veil of loyalty that once cloaked it. To them, fortification is both sanctuary and execution chamber, and they are the ones who decide which. Their existence also serves as a warning, and perhaps a grim comfort, to imperial strategists who imagine that the traitor legions remain monolithic entities bound by 10,000 years of habit. The Long War has revealed the lie in that assumption again and again, from the World Eaters warbands that have abandoned all semblance of legionary organization for the sake of unending slaughter, to the Night Lords packs who fight among themselves as readily as they assail the Imperium. Each splinter group has developed its own preferred modes and reputations. The Steel Brethren are simply one of the most focused examples of this evolution. Within the carcass of the Iron Warriors, they have carved out a doctrinal identity so sharp that it cuts even their own kin. In that sense, they fit neatly into the wider tapestry of the Long War. They are a demonstration of how hatred and purpose can calcify over the span of millennia, how initial grievances and disputes can become entire philosophies of destruction. The worlds they have broken are already dust in many cases, their names erased or marked as forbidden upon navigational charts. Yet the idea of the Steel Brethren persists, carried in whispers from trench to trench, from command bunker to command bunker, wherever men speak of sieges that ended far sooner than they should. Among those who have stood upon walls while the traitors closed in, the opinion can be more visceral. A veteran of the Imperial Fists, his armor scarred by more sieges than most mortal campaigns officers can imagine, once spoke under oath before the Ordo Astartes after a fortress moon in the Segmentum Pacificus fell. He had faced sons of Perturabo before and survived. He was not given to hyperbole. "They are us, if you strip away everything but numbers," he said, his voice a rasp filtered through damaged vox grills. "Facing them is like fighting a mirror that has already calculated how many of your brothers it will cost to break you. They do not waste shells. They do not waste steps. When they look at your walls, they are not impressed. They are measuring. They are deciding whether to take you apart from the top down or from the foundations up. You can hate them as much as you like. It will not change the sum at the bottom of their slate." His words were entered into the archive and cross-referenced with other testimonies from Black Templars, Imperial Fists, and even Iron Hands Brethren who had encountered similar hazard-striped foes. Over and over, the same themes arose: patience, precision, and a chilling absence of any emotion one might take advantage of. No taunt could goad them into rash charges. No plea for mercy could soften their hands. They treated loyalist defenses the way they treated their own failed patterns, as structures to be corrected or erased. There are, even now, Auspex ghosts on the fringes of new war zones that resemble the shadow of Ferrum Invictus. A Devastation-class cruiser silhouette lurks at long range in more than one fleet log, its name never positively identified, its heraldry blurred by distance and interference. Launch patterns recorded by panicking sensor crews show waves of small craft whose numbers and intervals match those seen above Vrax and other cursed worlds. In the moments before such augur recordings dissolve into static and fire, the same shape can sometimes be glimpsed: a lean iron hull, launch bays gaping, flanks studded with weapon moors, hazard striping flickering in reflected planetary flame. If that ship survived Vrax, and the balance of evidence suggests that it did, then somewhere in the depths of the warp, there remains a fortress monastery of iron still plying the currents between stars. Its holds are filled with siege engines and shame plates. Its forge decks echo with dark mechanicum canticles. Its shrines are lit by the cold blue of tactical hololiths, rather than by the warm glow of any sun. The Ordo Astartes, in one of its more candid assessments, phrases the matter thus in a recommendation sealed with sigils of highest secrecy. So long as there are walls in the Imperium, the sons of Perturabo will come to test them. Among those sons, the Steel Brethren stand as some of the most relentless. Their iron legacy is not measured in banners or honor rolls, but in the silent ruins of bastions that once dared to believe they could never fall.